My name is Rebecca Harmon. I am 38 years old, and I work as a senior compliance analyst at a financial services firm headquartered in downtown Chicago, Illinois. Most people in my professional circle describe me using the same three words: precise, invisible, and reliable. I have spent 11 years cultivating exactly that reputation, because in the world of corporate compliance, the most dangerous thing you can be is memorable. I am going to tell you something that took me a long time to understand about myself. I am not a brave person in the traditional sense of the word. I do not confront people in hallways. I do not raise my voice in meetings. I do not send angry emails or storm into offices with accusations. What I am is methodical. I think in timelines, in document trails, in the forensic architecture of numbers that should add up but quietly and deliberately do not. That particular skill set is exactly what made me the worst possible enemy for the man who tried to destroy me. Welcome to Quiet Karma Stories. It began on a Tuesday morning in March, during what should have been the most routine audit review of my entire career. I had been assigned to conduct a standard internal compliance sweep of the firm's mid-year financial reconciliation reports, specifically the operational expense accounts tied to our regional investment portfolio divisions. It was desk work. Dense, technical, and completely unglamorous. Exactly the kind of assignment that gets delegated to the analyst who never complains and never asks questions. I arrived at the office at 7:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before most of the building's inhabitants had even poured their first cup of coffee. I liked the office at that hour. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed at a lower frequency, the phones were silent, and the air smelled faintly of industrial cleaning solution and the ghost of yesterday's burnt coffee. I settled into my ergonomic chair, opened the encrypted audit portal on my desktop, and began pulling the quarterly expense reports for review. For the first 2 hours, everything was completely ordinary. I cross-referenced vendor invoices against payment authorizations, tracked operational disbursements against approved budget allocations, and flagged 3 minor discrepancies in the facility's maintenance accounts that were almost certainly clerical rounding errors. And then, at exactly 9:47 in the morning, I found something that made my fingers stop moving above the keyboard. It was buried in a secondary sub-ledger account attached to a dormant operational division that had been formally dissolved 14 months earlier. On paper, the division no longer existed. Its employees had been reassigned, its vendor contracts terminated, and its banking accounts administratively closed. But the sub-ledger was still open. And over the course of the previous fiscal year, a total of $6,240,000 had moved through it in a precise, methodical pattern of transactions that were individually small enough to avoid triggering the firm's automated fraud detection thresholds. I sat very still for a long time. I had been doing compliance work for 11 years. I had seen accidental errors, sloppy bookkeeping, and the occasional ethically questionable gray area transaction that someone had convinced themselves was technically permissible. What I was looking at was none of those things. The transaction pattern was too deliberate, too architecturally precise, and too carefully designed to mimic the visual noise of routine operational spending to be anything other than intentional. Someone had built this. Someone who understood the firm's internal audit systems well enough to know exactly how to make $6 million disappear inside them. I did not move from my desk for the next 4 hours. I pulled every associated document I could access within my clearance level, cross-referenced the vendor codes against our master contractor registry, and traced the receiving account numbers through every publicly available corporate registration database I had access to. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I had assembled a preliminary picture that was incomplete but already deeply incriminating. 3 of the vendor accounts receiving payments from the dormant subledger were registered shell companies incorporated in Delaware within the 18 months preceding the first fraudulent transaction. The registered agent for all 3 companies was the same individual, a name I did not recognize. But the correspondence address listed on 2 of the 3 company registrations was a residential property in Lake Forest, Illinois. I knew that address. I had seen it on a catered holiday party invitation 3 years earlier. It was the home address of our Chief Executive Officer, Daniel Mercer. I closed the audit portal, locked my desktop screen, and walked calmly to the bathroom at the end of the hallway. I ran cold water over my wrists and looked at my own reflection in the mirror above the sink for exactly 30 seconds. Then I dried my hands, straightened my blazer, and walked back to my desk. I had a decision to make. And I needed to make it before anyone in that building realized what I had found. By 5 o'clock that evening, I had made my decision. I encrypted the entire preliminary audit file using my personal security certificate, transferred it to a password-protected external drive I kept locked in my desk drawer, and emailed a compressed, encrypted copy to a private cloud storage account that was registered to a personal email address completely unconnected to the firm's systems. Then I went home, made dinner, and did not sleep. The following morning, I returned to the office. I did not tell anyone what I had found. I continued working as if the previous day had been entirely unremarkable. I answered emails. I attended a department scheduling call. I ate lunch at my desk. And I spent every remaining hour of that workday quietly, methodically, and invisibly building the most complete forensic financial audit report I had ever constructed in my professional life. I had no way of knowing, as I sat at my desk in that humming, fluorescent-lit office, that I had exactly 14 hours before everything would change. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body. It lives somewhere behind the sternum, in the dense, pressurized space between your lungs, and it feels less like tiredness and more like the sustained effort of holding a very heavy door shut against something on the other side that is trying very hard to get in. I drove home from the office on the second night feeling that exact weight. My apartment was on the 14th floor of a building in Lincoln Park, a neighborhood I had chosen 11 years earlier precisely because it was quiet and because the windows faced west and because the evening light on the lake in autumn was the closest thing to peace I had ever reliably been able to manufacture for myself. I had lived alone for 6 of those 11 years. I owned a small succulent collection on the windowsill, a good coffee machine, and approximately $4,000 worth of organizational shelving systems that I had assembled myself on a series of solitary Sunday afternoons. I parked in the building's underground garage, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and let myself into the apartment. I did not turn on any of the overhead lights. I walked directly to the window and stood there in the dark, looking out at the city below, the distant flat gleam of Lake Michigan at the horizon, and the moving red and white rivers of headlights on Lake Shore Drive. My phone had 12 unread messages. I did not open any of them. I needed to think with complete clarity, and clarity, in my experience, requires silence, stillness, and the absolute removal of anyone else's voice from the immediate environment. I went to the kitchen and filled the coffee machine. While it ran, I sat at the small table near the window with a yellow legal pad and a pen and began writing out everything I knew, in chronological order, in the plainest language I could manage. Not as an analyst. Not as an employee. As a witness. I wrote for 2 hours without stopping. By the time I put the pen down, the coffee was cold and the legal pad held 9 dense pages of handwritten notes, timelines, account numbers, and the names of the 3 shell companies and their shared registered agent. I read through everything once. Then I tore the pages into strips, fed them through the small crosscut shredder I kept in the corner of the home office, and poured myself a glass of water. The paper notes had served their purpose. They had forced my brain to process the information linearly, to organize the chaos of what I had discovered into a structure I could examine without the distortion of emotion. That was all I needed them for. The actual evidence was encrypted, backed up, and stored in 3 separate locations that no one in that office building could access. I sat back down at the kitchen table and allowed myself, for the first time since I had found the subledger, to think about Daniel Mercer specifically. I had worked at that firm for 11 years. Daniel Mercer had been its chief executive officer for the last 7. He was 61 years old, trim, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular variety of authoritative warmth that very powerful men cultivate specifically to make the people below them feel simultaneously valued and small. He remembered the names of employees' spouses. He gave personalized remarks at the annual holiday dinner. He had a framed photograph on his office credenza of himself shaking hands with 2 different senators. He was also, based on everything I had spent 48 hours documenting, the architect of a $6 million financial fraud that had been running inside his own company for over a year. I thought about the morning I had accepted this job, 11 years ago, sitting across from a different CEO in a different office, signing my employment contract with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who had worked very hard for a very long time and finally arrived somewhere stable. I thought about every year-end review, every meticulous audit completed on time, every inconvenient truth I had flagged through proper channels and watched get quietly resolved without ceremony or acknowledgement. I had been a good employee. I had been, in the language that firms like this one use to describe people who cause them no problems and generate no drama, an asset. And Daniel Mercer had built his personal financial escape hatch in the one corner of the firm's accounting architecture that he calculated no one would ever examine carefully enough to find it. He had calculated incorrectly. I got up from the kitchen table, went to the bathroom, and ran a bath. Not because I particularly wanted one, but because I understood that my body had been running on cortisol and focused adrenaline for 2 consecutive days and that if I did not deliberately interrupt that biochemical state, I would not be able to think with the precision that the next phase of this situation was going to require. I lay in the bath for 40 minutes, staring at the ceiling tiles, and made a series of very clear, very sequential decisions. First, I was not going to report internally. The internal reporting structure ran directly through Daniel Mercer. Any complaint filed through the firm's standard ethics hotline would land, ultimately, on the desk of the man I was reporting, or on the desk of someone whose continued employment depended on his goodwill. Internal reporting was not a route. It was a trap. Second, I was not going to retain a private attorney yet. Retaining an attorney before filing would create a paper trail that could be detected and that would give Mercer's team time to construct a counternarrative. The sequence had to be federal first, legal counsel second. Third, I was going to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Specifically, I was going to the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower, which had been established precisely for situations like this one and which offered, under the Dodd-Frank Act, both federal anti-retaliation protections and, in cases of successful enforcement actions, financial awards to qualifying whistleblowers. I had spent 40 minutes of my lunch break the previous day reading the SEC whistleblower submission guidelines in their entirety. I had downloaded the Form TCR. I had noted the submission portal address. I got out of the bath, dried off, put on clean clothes, and sat down at my personal laptop. Not my work laptop. My personal one, on my personal home internet connection, with the virtual private network application I had installed 3 months earlier for entirely unrelated reasons now serving a considerably more important purpose. I opened the SEC whistleblower submission portal. I uploaded the encrypted audit file. I filled out the Form TCR with the methodical, precise, emotionally neutral efficiency of someone who had spent 11 years documenting things for a living. I submitted the form at 11:43 in the evening. Then I closed the laptop, turned off the lamp on my nightstand, and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling for a long time before my body finally decided it was safe enough to sleep. I did not know, lying there in the quiet dark of my Lincoln Park apartment, that in less than 8 hours I would be sitting across from Daniel Mercer in his corner office while he told me, in the calm and measured tone of a man who had never once considered that he might be wrong about anything, to delete every copy of the report. What he did not know was that there were no copies left to delete. The original was already in federal hands. The meeting with Daniel Mercer happened the following morning at 10 o'clock. His assistant, a composed young man named Philip who had held the position for 3 years and who communicated exclusively through a combination of precise calendar invitations and carefully modulated facial expressions, appeared at my desk at 9:52 and informed me that Mr. Mercer would like to see me at my earliest convenience, which in the language of executive assistants means immediately and without discussion. I saved the spreadsheet I had been working on, locked my desktop screen, picked up a legal pad and a pen, and followed Philip down the long corridor to the corner office. Daniel Mercer's office occupied the southeast corner of the 31st floor. It had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 walls, a view of the Chicago River on one side and the architectural canyon of the financial district on the other. The furniture was the kind of furniture that announces its own cost without appearing to try. He was standing at the window when I entered, hands clasped behind his back, looking at the river below with the posture of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk without turning around. I sat down. He turned, crossed to his desk, and sat. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he opened the top drawer of his desk, removed a single printed document, and slid it across the polished surface toward me. It was a printout of my internal audit access log from the previous 2 days. Every file I had opened, every account I had queried, every database I had searched was recorded in precise chronological order. Someone in the firm's IT security department had generated it, recently enough that the timestamp on the document was from this morning. I looked at the document. I looked at Daniel Mercer. I said nothing. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on the desk in front of him. His voice, when he spoke, was completely level. "Rebecca," he said. "You have been with this firm for 11 years. You are one of the most meticulous analysts we have. That is exactly why I want to have this conversation directly, before anything becomes unnecessarily complicated." I waited. He continued. "The accounts you accessed yesterday are part of a legacy restructuring project that was handled at the board level before your audit clearance was expanded. There are confidentiality protocols around those accounts that are not reflected in the standard audit system permissions. What you are looking at is not what it appears to be. It is board authorized. It is documented at a level above your access tier." I kept my face completely neutral. I had spent 11 years keeping my face completely neutral in rooms with powerful people who were telling me things I was not certain were true. He held my gaze for a moment, then slid a second item across the desk. It was a sealed envelope with my name on it. "This is a standard non-disclosure agreement covering the legacy restructuring materials," he said. "Standard legal procedure. HR will process a supplemental clearance notation this afternoon. I need you to delete the copies of those files from your audit workstation and return any external documentation you may have generated, and we will consider this matter fully resolved." He paused. "I want to be clear," he said, "that this is a routine administrative matter. It will have no impact whatsoever on your standing with the firm." I picked up the envelope. I looked at it. I set it back on the desk. "I understand," I said. "I will take care of it this afternoon." He nodded once, the nod of a man who had just resolved something efficiently. I picked up my legal pad, stood, and walked out of the office. Philip was at his desk in the anteroom, eyes on his monitor, carefully not looking at me. I walked past him and back down the corridor to my own desk, sat down, unlocked my screen, and opened the spreadsheet I had been working on before the meeting. I did not delete any files. There were no files left to delete. Every copy was already in federal hands or encrypted behind passwords that existed only in my memory. But what Daniel Mercer had told me in that office, specifically what he had gotten fractionally wrong in his attempt to sound completely authoritative, had given me something I had not had before. He had said board authorized. He had said documented at a level above my access tier. He had described the accounts as part of a legacy restructuring project handled before my audit clearance was expanded. My audit clearance had been expanded 14 months ago. The first fraudulent transaction in the dormant subledger had occurred 13 months ago. Whoever had built this fraud had begun building it 1 month after my access level was upgraded. 1 month after I would have been able to see it if I had been looking in the right place. That was not coincidence. That was a calculated operational timeline built by someone who knew exactly what my clearance level was, when it had changed, and how to structure transactions to remain just below the thresholds that would have triggered an automatic flag in my expanded audit scope. Someone had built this fraud with specific knowledge of the firm's internal compliance architecture. Not general knowledge. Specific, current, operational knowledge of the exact parameters of my access permissions. I sat at my desk and felt the full cold weight of what that meant settle over me. This was not a CEO acting alone. This required inside knowledge of the compliance department's operational parameters. It required someone with access to both the executive financial accounts and the internal audit system configuration. I thought of every person in the firm who would have had simultaneous access to both of those systems. The list was not long. It included the chief financial officer, the head of internal audit, the chief information security officer, and the 2 members of the IT security team who managed audit system permissions. One of those people had helped build this. I opened a new encrypted document on my personal cloud storage account and began typing. Not the external fraud this time. The internal architecture of how it had been concealed. By noon, I had identified 3 additional anomalies I had not found during my initial review. The first was a pattern of audit system permission modification requests filed over the preceding 18 months that had systematically narrowed the automated detection parameters in the firm's fraud monitoring software in increments small enough that no single modification would have raised a flag. Individually, each change was defensible as a routine system optimization. Collectively, they formed a deliberate corridor of blind spots. The second anomaly was a series of internal compliance review scheduling changes that had consistently redirected quarterly audit attention away from the operational expense accounts where the fraudulent transactions were occurring, for 5 consecutive quarters, attributed to workload balancing decisions made by my direct supervisor. My direct supervisor, whose name appeared on the permission modification requests with a frequency that I now found considerably less coincidental than it would have seemed yesterday morning. The third anomaly was the non-disclosure agreement that Daniel Mercer had attempted to have me sign. I looked up the legal registration of the document. The law firm that had prepared it was not the firm's standard outside counsel. It was a boutique Chicago practice that specialized in financial regulatory defense. Someone had prepared that non-disclosure agreement before this morning's meeting. Which meant Daniel Mercer had known about my audit activity before he summoned me to his office. Which meant someone had been watching my access logs in real time and had alerted him. I was not dealing with one person who had committed a fraud. I was sitting inside a coordinated criminal operation that had been running for over a year, that had deliberately and methodically shaped the firm's internal compliance architecture to conceal itself, and that was now aware that I had found it. I picked up my personal cell phone and sent a single text message to a number I had looked up 3 days earlier and saved under a contact name that meant nothing to anyone who might see my phone. The text said, "I submitted a TCR on Tuesday night. I believe the scope is significantly larger than the initial filing. I need to speak to someone today." The response came 11 minutes later. It said, "We received your submission. We have been waiting for your call. Are you safe at your current location?" I looked around the quiet open-plan office, at my colleagues typing at their keyboards, at the glass walls of the conference rooms, at the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling above the copier room. I typed back, "I am at work. I need to step outside." I picked up my coat, my personal phone, and my keys. I told no one where I was going. I took the elevator to the lobby, walked through the revolving glass doors, and stepped out into the cold March air of the Chicago financial district. The SEC investigator answered on the first ring. The SEC investigator's name was Thomas Garrett. He was not what I had imagined, which I recognized was an irrational thing to notice given that I had spent less than 4 seconds imagining anything about him before he answered the phone. He sounded mid-40s, unhurried, and possessed of the particular quality of attention that people develop when their professional survival depends on hearing not just what someone says but how they say it. I stood on the sidewalk outside my office building, coat buttoned against the March wind coming off the river, and told him everything in the same order I had written it in my encrypted document. I did not editorialize. I did not express emotion. I presented the facts as a sequence of documented events with timestamps and account references, the way I had been trained to present audit findings, the way I had spent 11 years learning to make complex information legible to people who needed to act on it. Garrett listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then he said, "Ms. Harmon, I want you to understand the significance of what you have just described. Your initial submission was flagged within 6 hours of receipt by our enforcement division. What you are telling me now suggests that the scope of potential violations extends beyond financial fraud into potential obstruction and conspiracy. Do you understand what that means procedurally?" I said that I did. He asked me 3 specific questions about the permission modification timeline, the non-disclosure agreement registration, and the identity of my direct supervisor. I answered each one precisely. He asked me to forward the additional documentation I had compiled to the same encrypted submission portal I had used for the initial filing, using a specific case reference number he provided. Before we ended the call, he said one more thing. "Ms. Harmon," he said, "I want to be direct with you. You are currently inside a building where at least 2 individuals are aware that you have accessed information they consider threatening. I am not telling you that you are in physical danger. I am telling you that you should assume your digital activity within that building's network is being monitored as of this morning. Do not access any of your documentation from your work devices. Do not discuss this matter with any colleague. And do not, under any circumstances, sign anything anyone puts in front of you without speaking to an attorney first." I thanked him, ended the call, and stood on the sidewalk for another minute. The wind was cold enough to make my eyes water. Or perhaps it was something else. I was not entirely certain, and I did not examine the question carefully because I had a great deal of very precise work to do, and I had found, over the course of my adult life, that precision and grief do not operate effectively in the same cognitive space at the same time. But grief was the correct word for what was sitting in my chest as I stood on that sidewalk. I had given 11 years of meticulous, reliable work to an institution that had, at its core, been rotten in ways I had not seen. And the particular cruelty of my professional skill set was that I could not unsee data once I had seen it. I could not decide that the numbers were probably fine and that someone else would handle it. I was constitutionally incapable of looking at $6 million moving through a dormant account in a pattern that was architecturally identical to fraud and concluding that it was probably a misunderstanding. I had not chosen to find this. I had simply done my job with the same thoroughness I had always applied to my job, and my job had walked me directly into the center of something I could not walk back out of unchanged. I thought about the version of this morning that did not exist. The version where I had signed the non-disclosure agreement and deleted the files I had already moved beyond his reach and accepted the supplemental clearance notation and gone back to my desk and continued being precise, invisible, and reliable for another 11 years. That version of Rebecca Harmon would have gone home tonight and made dinner and fed her succulents and slept without difficulty. She would also have spent the rest of her career as a compliance analyst at a firm whose chief executive officer had stolen $6 million from its investors and whose internal control systems had been deliberately dismantled by a coordinated group of senior employees to facilitate that theft. And if that fraud had eventually surfaced through some other means, through an external audit, a disgruntled employee, a regulatory sweep, that version of Rebecca Harmon would have had her name on 11 years of compliance certifications attesting to the integrity of the very systems she had watched being quietly hollowed out. I am not a brave person. But I am a person who understands liability. I went back inside. I rode the elevator to the 31st floor. I sat down at my desk and opened my spreadsheet and continued working as if the morning had been unremarkable. I made 3 decisions during the remainder of that afternoon, and I made them with the same cold methodical clarity I had been applying to everything since Tuesday morning. The first decision was that I was not going to resign. Resignation would be interpreted as guilt, or at minimum as an acknowledgement that I had done something wrong. It would also remove my access to any additional documentation that might strengthen the federal case, and it would signal to Mercer and whoever else was involved that I was frightened enough to run. I was not going to give them that information. The second decision was that I was going to retain a whistleblower attorney before the end of the week. Not because I intended to take any legal action independently, but because I needed someone who understood both federal whistleblower protections and employment law to stand between me and whatever the firm's legal team was currently preparing. Garrett had been clear that federal anti-retaliation protections applied to my situation, but federal protections and practical corporate reality are two different things, and I intended to be represented by someone who understood both. The third decision was the hardest one, and it was not a tactical decision. It was a personal one. I decided not to be angry. This requires some explanation, because I want to be precise about what I mean. I was angry. The anger was real and it was proportionate, and it was sitting in my body like a low-frequency electrical current that I could feel in my jaw and my shoulders and the tendons of my hands when I typed. I am not suggesting that the anger was wrong or that I suppressed it. What I decided was that I was not going to let it move me before I was ready to move. Anger is an extraordinarily useful fuel for action. It is a terrible compass for the direction of that action. Daniel Mercer had spent his entire career learning how to manage people who were visibly angry with him. He knew how to reframe anger as instability. He knew how to redirect it into a narrative about the angry person's character rather than his own behavior. He had a legal team, an HR department, and 11 years of relationship capital with the firm's board of directors, and every single one of those resources would be deployed, rapidly and effectively, the moment I gave him a visible emotional target to aim at. I was not going to be a visible emotional target. I was going to be a compliance analyst doing her job with the same precise, invisible reliability she had demonstrated for 11 consecutive years, right up until the moment a federal enforcement action made that irrelevant. I signed off at 6:15, exactly when I always signed off. I exchanged pleasantries with the colleague whose desk was adjacent to mine about the weather forecast for the weekend. I waited for the elevator with 3 other people and made small talk about the coffee machine on the 29th floor that had been malfunctioning for 2 weeks. I walked to my car in the underground garage, sat down in the driver's seat, and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes of feeling the full weight of everything I had decided. Then I started the car and drove home. There was a great deal of work still to do. There is a particular kind of power that comes from learning something that the people threatening you do not know you are learning. I had always understood this intellectually. I had spent my career inside a professional discipline that was fundamentally about the asymmetry of information, about the strategic advantage that accrues to the person who knows more, sees further, and documents earlier than the person they are evaluating. But I had always applied that understanding outward, toward the work, toward the accounts and the ledgers and the transaction histories that constituted my professional landscape. In the 2 weeks following my conversation with Thomas Garrett, I turned it inward. I began building the most important knowledge base I had ever constructed, not for the firm, not for an audit file, but for myself. It started, practically speaking, with the law. I had retained a whistleblower attorney named Claire Nakamura 4 days after my sidewalk phone call with Garrett. She came recommended by a colleague of a colleague through a chain of communication I had been careful to conduct entirely through personal channels, never once touching the firm's email system, its phone network, or any device connected to its servers. Claire was 44, compact in her movements, and communicated with the kind of bone-dry precision that I found immediately trustworthy. She had spent 12 years at the SEC's Enforcement Division before entering private practice, which meant she understood the federal machinery I was now inside from both directions simultaneously. Our first meeting was in her office on a Thursday evening. She reviewed my documentation for 90 minutes without speaking. When she finished, she closed the folder, placed her hands flat on her desk, and looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating an initial assessment. "You built this yourself," she said. "In 2 days. While you were still in the building." I confirmed that I had. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had represented 43 whistleblower clients over the course of her private practice. She said that the quality of pre-submission documentation varied enormously, and that in the majority of cases her primary early work involved helping clients reconstruct evidentiary timelines from incomplete records. She said my file had the organizational architecture of a federal forensic audit report. I told her that was essentially what I had been trying to construct. She said she would take the case. Claire's representation gave me two things that I had not previously had. The first was a legally protected communication channel through which I could discuss the case freely without concern about surveillance. The second was an education. Over the following weeks, Claire walked me through the Dodd-Frank whistleblower provisions in operational detail. She explained the SEC enforcement timeline, the criteria for whistleblower award eligibility, the specific documentation standards that would maximize the evidentiary value of my submission, and the precise legal boundaries of the firm's ability to retaliate against me without triggering additional federal liability for themselves. I took notes at every meeting in a dedicated notebook that I kept at home, never in the office. In the evenings, I read SEC enforcement actions. I read case law on whistleblower protections. I read forensic accounting methodology papers and financial fraud investigation procedures and the Department of Justice's guidance documents on corporate criminal liability. I was not building this knowledge because I intended to practice law or become a federal investigator. I was building it because I understood, from 11 years of professional experience, that the most dangerous position in any adversarial situation is one where you are dependent on other people to explain to you what is happening. I intended to be a client who understood her own case well enough that nothing Claire told me was opaque, and nothing the firm's legal team might attempt would catch me unprepared. But the education was only part of it. The other thing I did during those weeks, the thing that looked from the outside like the least consequential and that was in reality the most important, was this: I began writing. Not the encrypted audit documentation. Not the case notes. Something different. In the evenings, after the day's research was finished, I began writing a detailed, narrative account of my 11 years in corporate compliance. Not as a legal document. As a record of what it actually looks like from the inside of a large financial institution when the internal controls that are supposed to protect investors are functioning, when they are failing, and when they are being deliberately dismantled by the people responsible for maintaining them. I wrote about the anatomy of a compliance department. I wrote about the specific professional pressures that make it difficult for analysts to flag anomalies when those anomalies implicate senior management. I wrote about the gap between what internal audit systems are theoretically designed to catch and what they actually catch in practice when the people configuring them have interests in their failure. I wrote about the particular professional loneliness of being very good at a job whose entire value proposition depends on independence, in an environment that structurally rewards loyalty. I was not writing this for publication. I was writing it because writing is how I have always processed experience, the same way other people run or cook or call their mothers, and because the process of articulating something precisely, of finding the exact language for it, changes your relationship to it. It moves experience from the category of things that are happening to you into the category of things you are examining, and that shift in perspective, that tiny grammatical change from passive to active, is the difference between drowning and swimming. By the third week, something had shifted in my body that I noticed first as an absence. The low electrical current of anger that had been running through my jaw and shoulders since the morning of the board meeting was quieter. Not gone. Quieter. I went to the office every day. I did my work with my standard thoroughness. I exchanged my standard pleasantries. I attended my standard meetings and filed my standard reports and drank coffee from the still malfunctioning machine on the 29th floor and gave no visible indication that anything in my professional life was other than completely ordinary. Daniel Mercer passed me in the corridor twice during those weeks. Both times he met my eyes, nodded once in the measured way of a senior executive acknowledging a junior employee, and continued walking. Both times I returned the nod with the same neutrality. Neither of us said anything. He believed the matter was resolved. He believed I had deleted the files, signed the agreement, and accepted the official explanation. He believed I was exactly what I had always appeared to be, precise, invisible, and no threat to anyone. What he did not know was that the woman who walked past him in that corridor every morning was no longer the same woman who had sat across his desk 3 weeks earlier. That woman had been alone inside something she did not fully understand, working from instinct and professional discipline and a deep stubborn refusal to delete things that were true. The woman in the corridor now had federal representation, a legally protected evidentiary record, an expanding command of whistleblower law, and a written account of 11 years inside his institution that she could, if the situation required it, place in front of any journalist, regulator, or congressional investigator in the country. She was not scared. She had moved past scared into something much quieter and considerably more durable. She was ready. I have always been suspicious of coincidence. In 11 years of compliance work I had learned, with a certainty that had become something close to professional doctrine, that what presents itself as coincidence in financial systems is almost always pattern recognition arriving slightly ahead of conscious understanding. When something feels wrong before you can articulate why it is wrong, that feeling is not intuition in the mystical sense. It is your brain processing data faster than your verbal centers can translate it. This is what I thought about when Martin Ellison walked back into my professional life on a Wednesday morning in the 4th week of what I had begun privately thinking of as the waiting period. Martin had been a senior external auditor at a Chicago-based accounting firm for 23 years. We had worked together during a regulatory compliance review at my firm 4 years earlier, a 6-week engagement during which I had spent considerable time in the same conference rooms as Martin and had developed for him the specific professional respect that comes from watching someone be genuinely excellent at a technically demanding job without any apparent need for recognition. Martin was 60, slightly rumpled in the way of men who are too interested in the work to spend significant energy on appearances, and he communicated primarily through a combination of precisely worded written observations and long silences that were more comfortable than most conversations. He sent me an email on that Wednesday morning. Not to my work address. To my personal email. The subject line said, "Lunch, if you have time this week." I stared at the message for a long time. Martin and I had exchanged perhaps 4 emails in the 2 years since his firm's engagement with mine had concluded. The timing was not coincidental. The choice of my personal address rather than my professional one was deliberate. I knew this the way I knew most things, by looking at the data available and drawing the most defensible conclusion. I wrote back and said I was available Thursday. We met at a small Italian restaurant on the north side, the kind of place with paper tablecloths and very good food and enough ambient noise to make casual eavesdropping impractical. Martin was already seated when I arrived. He had ordered sparkling water for both of us and was reading something on his phone with the focused attention he applied to everything. He put the phone away when I sat down, looked at me for a moment, and said, "I am going to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond." I told him I was listening. He said that his firm had been engaged 6 months earlier to conduct a routine external audit of a mid-sized investment management company that shared several institutional banking relationships with my firm. He said that during the course of that audit, his team had encountered anomalies in a series of interinstitutional transfer records that bore structural similarities to a pattern he had seen only twice before in his career. Both previous instances had ultimately been classified as coordinated internal fraud. He said that when he had begun tracing the transfer patterns further, one of the receiving account chains had terminated at a set of Delaware-registered shell companies. He paused and looked at me steadily across the paper tablecloth. "I recognized 2 of the company names," he said quietly. "I had seen them in documentation during our engagement with your firm 4 years ago. They were listed as dormant legacy vendor accounts at the time. I assumed they had been properly closed. When I saw them active in these new transfer records, I went back to my notes from your firm's engagement." He opened a folder he had carried in under his arm and placed it on the table between us, face down. Rebecca, he said, using my first name in a way that felt deliberate and careful. I do not know exactly what you know. But I know you accessed those accounts 3 weeks ago from your internal audit system, because my contact at your firm's IT security department mentioned it in the context of a broader conversation about a compliance irregularity that had been, and I am quoting directly here, internally resolved. He turned the folder over. Inside were 12 pages of annotated transfer records with his handwritten margin notes in the precise, compressed script I remembered from 4 years of engagement reports. I think we have been looking at different parts of the same thing, he said. I looked at the documents. I looked at Martin. And then I did something I had not done with anyone in 27 days. I told him everything. Not recklessly. I told him what Claire Nakamura had established was legally permissible for me to share with a third party who had independent evidentiary standing in a related matter. I had asked Claire precisely this question 2 weeks earlier, in the specific context of potential allied witnesses with independent documentation, because I had learned in 11 years of compliance work that the most powerful evidence is corroborated evidence and that a federal investigation with 1 witness is a case and a federal investigation with 2 witnesses and independent documentation is a conviction. Martin listened without interrupting, exactly as I had known he would. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked 2 questions. The first was the name of my attorney. The second was whether the SEC engagement had been assigned to the Enforcement Division or the Examination Division. When I answered both, he nodded once, slowly, with the expression of someone updating a significant internal calculation. I need to make a phone call this afternoon, he said. I have a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit who I have worked with on 2 previous cases. What you are describing crosses into wire fraud territory that extends beyond the SEC's primary jurisdiction. The 2 agencies have a coordination protocol for cases of this scope. He looked at me directly. I want you to understand what this means practically, he said. If I make this call, the scope of the investigation expands. The number of agencies involved increases. The timeline accelerates. And the people inside your firm who are aware that you found something are going to feel that acceleration before they understand its source. I picked up my water glass. I set it back down. Make the call, I said. Martin closed the folder, tucked it back under his arm, and picked up the menu. Then he looked at it for a moment and set it back on the table. The pasta here is excellent, he said, in exactly the tone he had used 4 years ago when reviewing quarterly reconciliation reports. I always order the Cacio e Pepe. We spent the rest of lunch talking about the accounting industry's evolving approach to machine learning in fraud detection, the way we might have on any unremarkable afternoon 4 years earlier when neither of us had been carrying anything heavier than a briefcase. By the time I got back to the office, Martin had already sent me a single-line email to my personal address. It said, "Call made. 2 agencies now. Stand by." I sat at my desk, unlocked my screen, and returned to the spreadsheet I had been working on that morning. Outside the window, 31 floors below, the Chicago River moved in its slow, indifferent way toward the lake, carrying everything downstream whether anyone was watching or not. There is an art to building an evidence file that will survive the scrutiny of a federal prosecutor, 2 defense attorneys, and a district court judge. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like the decisive moment in a film where the protagonist discovers the single incriminating document that unravels everything. It feels like 11 days of meticulous, methodical work conducted in the margins of an ordinary professional life, in the hours before the office opens and the hours after it closes and the long weekend afternoons when the building is nearly empty and the only sound is the ventilation system and the distant ambient noise of the city below. It feels, in other words, exactly like compliance work. Which is precisely why I was equipped for it in a way that Daniel Mercer and the people around him had fundamentally failed to anticipate. Claire Nakamura and Thomas Garrett had given me a specific framework during a joint call in the second week of the waiting period. Federal financial fraud cases rest on 3 evidentiary pillars: the documentation of the fraudulent transactions themselves, the documentation of intent, and the documentation of concealment. The first pillar I had established in the initial 48 hours. The second and third required more time, more precision, and access to sources of information that existed outside the firm's internal systems. I began with the public record. Delaware corporate registrations are public documents. The 3 shell companies I had identified in the subledger were registered entities with publicly searchable filing histories. Over the course of 2 evenings, I pulled every available public filing for all 3 companies: articles of incorporation, registered agent designations, annual report filings, and any associated UCC financing statements. I organized them into a single annotated document with timestamps and cross-references to the corresponding internal transaction records. The registered agent for all 3 companies was a man named Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch was also, according to his LinkedIn profile, a retired paralegal who had worked for 31 years at a boutique transactional law firm in Wilmington, Delaware, before retiring 18 months earlier. He had 94 connections on LinkedIn and a profile photograph that suggested he was approximately 70 years old and genuinely pleased about both fishing and his grandchildren. I forwarded his name and contact information to Garrett at the SEC. Within 48 hours, Garrett confirmed that Gerald Fitch had been interviewed and had provided a full voluntary statement. He was not a criminal. He was a retired paralegal who had been approached through a former professional contact and paid a flat fee of $300 each to serve as the nominal registered agent for 3 Delaware LLCs, which he had understood to be straightforward holding companies. He had signed the paperwork and heard nothing further. He had kept meticulous records of everything, including the email chain through which the engagement had been arranged. The email chain traced back to an account registered to my firm's general counsel. This was the moment the shape of the conspiracy fully clarified. Daniel Mercer had not built this alone. He had the chief financial officer managing the internal transaction architecture, the head of internal audit systematically narrowing the firm's fraud detection parameters, and the general counsel providing the legal infrastructure for the shell companies and the non-disclosure mechanisms. 3 senior executives, operating in coordinated silence, each responsible for a discrete component of a system that required all 3 to function. It was elegant, in the specific way that financial crimes built by intelligent people are elegant. Each individual piece was defensible in isolation. The CFO could explain any single transaction modification as a routine financial management decision. The head of internal audit could justify any individual system configuration change as an operational optimization. The general counsel could produce legitimate justifications for maintaining relationships with outside legal firms. It was only when you assembled all 3 layers simultaneously, when you looked at the complete architecture rather than any individual component, that the design became visible. This was exactly what a compliance analyst was trained to do. I spent the following 6 days building what Claire later described as the most organized pre-litigation evidence file she had seen in 14 years of practice. I assembled it in 3 sections, each corresponding to one of the federal evidentiary pillars. The first section contained the transaction documentation, the complete subledger records, the shell company registration filings, the payment routing trails, and the bank account connection analysis that Martin Ellison's external audit documentation had provided, which established the link between my firm's fraudulent transactions and the parallel scheme he had uncovered in the related investment company. The second section contained the intent documentation, the email chain to Gerald Fitch establishing the deliberate creation of the shell company infrastructure, the timeline analysis demonstrating that the fraud architecture had been built in the specific window between my clearance level upgrade and my first access to the relevant accounts, and 3 instances of internal communications I had been able to access through my legitimate audit clearance that showed the CFO and the head of internal audit discussing the audit detection parameters in language that was inconsistent with routine operational optimization. The third section was the most painstaking and the most important. It contained the concealment documentation. The concealment documentation included the audit system permission modification timeline, the systematic scheduling changes that had redirected quarterly audit attention away from the relevant accounts, the non-disclosure agreement that the General Counsel had prepared before my meeting with Mercer, the meeting itself which I had reconstructed from memory into a sworn written statement reviewed and certified by Claire, and the IT security access log printout that Mercer had produced during that meeting, which demonstrated that my audit activity had been monitored in real time and reported to him before he summoned me to his office. That last item was particularly significant. The real-time monitoring of an internal auditor's access logs by the CEO of the company being audited was not a routine security procedure. It was evidence of a surveillance operation designed to protect a fraud from discovery. It was, in Claire's precise legal framing, consciousness of guilt with documentary corroboration. On the 11th day I sent the complete 3-section file to both Claire and Garrett through the encrypted submission portal, with a cover document summarizing the evidentiary structure and flagging the 7 specific items that I considered most significant for the purposes of the enforcement action. Garrett called me that evening on my personal phone. "Ms. Harmon," he said, and his voice had the quality of someone who was choosing words carefully because the ones that were available to him were larger than he usually used in professional communications. "The Enforcement Division reviewed your submission this afternoon. I want you to know that what you have built here is exceptional. We are moving to formal enforcement posture. I need to brief you on what that means for your immediate situation." I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Outside the window the city moved in its ordinary evening way, headlights and pedestrians and the distant wail of a siren fading north along the lakefront. I told him I was ready to be briefed. What he told me in the following 20 minutes changed the operational reality of everything I had been managing for the past 5 weeks. The investigation was no longer mine to manage. It had expanded into something considerably larger than one analyst and one fraudulent subledger account. Martin's FBI contact had opened a parallel criminal referral. A federal grand jury had been quietly impaneled. 3 additional financial institutions connected to the shell company network had been identified and were under examination. The enforcement timeline had compressed significantly. And within the firm, something was beginning to shift. Garrett said it carefully, using the language of federal procedure, but the meaning was unmistakable. Someone inside the building had noticed that the SEC's routine examination calendar, which financial firms of a certain size monitor with the same routine attention they give to earnings cycles, had developed an anomaly. An unscheduled inquiry. A request for certain documentation categories that, to anyone who knew what to look for, pointed in a very specific direction. Daniel Mercer, Garrett told me, had retained outside criminal defense counsel 2 days ago. He knew the investigation existed. He did not yet know how far it had progressed, or what it contained. But he knew something was moving toward him. Which meant the next phase of this situation was no longer about building the case. The case was built. It was about what happened when a cornered man decided to act. A cornered man with resources is a specific kind of dangerous. He is not dangerous in the way of someone who has nothing to lose. He is dangerous in the way of someone who has a great deal to lose in the infrastructure, the lawyers, the institutional relationships, the practiced authority, to deploy that infrastructure rapidly and with precision. Daniel Mercer had built a career on the management of difficult situations. He had navigated 2 regulatory reviews, 1 shareholder dispute, and a hostile board challenge during his 7 years as chief executive officer. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who calculated. I had known this was coming. I had discussed it with Claire in specific tactical detail during 3 separate meetings in the preceding 2 weeks. We had mapped out the most likely forms of attack, the legal mechanisms available to the firm to apply pressure to a sitting employee who might be cooperating with a federal investigation, and the precise responses that would protect my legal position while giving nothing away about the state of the investigation. I was as prepared as it was possible to be. What I had not fully prepared for was the particular quality of sitting in a room with a man who is trying to destroy you while both of you maintain the complete performance of professional normalcy. He called me into his office on a Monday morning in the 6th week. No advance notice. Philip appeared at my desk at 9:40 and delivered the familiar formulation about earliest convenience. I picked up my legal pad, took the elevator to the 31st floor, and sat down across from Daniel Mercer for the second time. He looked, I noted, different from the last time I had sat in this chair. The silver hair was the same, the tailored suit was the same, the floor-to-ceiling windows and the river view were the same. But something in the arrangement of his features had changed in a way that was subtle enough to be deniable and unmistakable to anyone paying attention. There was a controlled tightness around his jaw. His eyes moved to my face and stayed there with a quality of attention that was slightly too focused to be casual. He had a folder on the desk in front of him. He opened it without speaking and turned it to face me. It was a performance review. Dated last Friday. Signed by my direct supervisor and countersigned by the head of human resources. The overall rating was listed as below expectations, the lowest category on the firm's formal evaluation scale. The written narrative cited declining productivity metrics, a pattern of unauthorized database queries outside my designated audit scope, failure to comply with data security protocols, and, most carefully worded of all, concerns about professional judgment and adherence to departmental confidentiality standards. Every item was fabricated. Every item was also, individually, sufficiently vague to be defended in an employment tribunal as a subjective professional assessment. I read the document completely. I looked up. "Rebecca," Mercer said, in the measured tone of a man who had rehearsed this, "I want to be direct with you. This review reflects genuine concerns that have been building within your department. I think you are a talented analyst who has been under significant stress, and I believe that stress has affected your performance and your judgment. We want to support you through a formal performance improvement plan rather than move immediately to a separation. But I need your full cooperation and your commitment to the protocols we discussed in our last conversation." He held my gaze. The word cooperation landed in the space between us with its full weight and its full implication. I looked at the performance review. I looked at Daniel Mercer. I thought about Claire Nakamura sitting in her office on the north side of the city, where she was spending this Monday morning reviewing the draft motion that would be filed the moment any retaliatory employment action was taken against me. I thought about Thomas Garrett at the SEC Enforcement Division, where the formal investigation now involved 4 federal agencies and a grand jury that had been impaneled for 11 days. I thought about Martin Ellison and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit contact and the 3 other financial institutions currently under examination and the 23 months of transaction records that had been subpoenaed from 4 different banking institutions. I thought about Gerald Fitch, the retired paralegal in Wilmington, who had kept meticulous records of everything. I looked back at Daniel Mercer. "I appreciate you sharing these concerns directly," I said, in a voice that was completely level and entirely pleasant. "I would like the opportunity to review this documentation carefully and respond through the appropriate HR process. I would also like to loop in my personal employment attorney before signing or acknowledging any formal performance documentation. I hope that is acceptable." Something moved behind his eyes. It was brief and controlled and he recovered it quickly, but I had been watching his face with the full focused attention I applied to anomalous transaction patterns, and I saw it. He had expected one of 2 responses. He had expected either visible distress, the response of someone frightened enough to capitulate, or visible defiance, the response of someone angry enough to say something that could be used against them. What I had given him was neither. I had given him the calm, procedurally correct response of someone who was being represented by counsel and who knew precisely what their rights were and precisely what the firm was and was not legally permitted to do to them. He could not interpret that response without more information than he had. And that uncertainty was, at this precise moment, my most valuable asset. "Of course," he said, after a pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds longer than comfort permitted. "Please have your attorney reach out to our HR department directly. We want to handle this collaboratively." I thanked him, stood, collected my legal pad, and walked out of the office. In the elevator on the way back to my floor, I sent Claire a text from my personal phone. It contained 4 words: performance review. Formal PIP. She replied in 40 seconds, perfect. Do not sign anything. Call me at noon. I put the phone back in my bag, watched the elevator floor numbers descend, and regulated my breathing with the deliberate attention of someone who has been practicing this particular skill for 6 weeks and has become considerably more proficient at it than they were at the beginning. The performance review was not an attack in the sense of something unexpected. It was the expected move of a man who had decided that the best defense was a preemptive discrediting of the witness. If he could establish a documented record of my poor judgment and protocol violations before the investigation became public, he would have a narrative to deploy when my role in the case became known. She was a disgruntled employee with a history of performance issues. Her motivations were retaliatory. Her documentation was the product of unauthorized access driven by personal grievance. It was a reasonable strategy. It was the strategy one would have anticipated from a man of his intelligence and resources. It had one significant flaw. The Dodd-Frank Act's anti-retaliation provisions do not require a whistleblower to have an unblemished performance record to be protected. They require that the employer knew or suspected that the employee had made a protected disclosure when the retaliatory action was taken. The performance review had been dated 5 weeks after my SEC submission and 3 weeks after Mercer had personally instructed me to delete my audit files. The timeline was not ambiguous. The performance review was not a trap. It was evidence. Claire had explained this to me during our second meeting, in precisely those words. Every retaliatory action they take strengthens the enforcement case and creates independent civil liability for the firm. The best thing Daniel Mercer can do for you right now is continue trying to intimidate you through official channels. He was, I reflected as I walked back to my desk and sat down and opened my spreadsheet, doing an excellent job. The week after the performance review, Claire Nakamura filed 3 documents. The first was a formal written response to the firm's HR department, submitted on my behalf, declining to acknowledge the performance review as a valid assessment, citing 14 specific factual inaccuracies in the written narrative, and formally notifying the firm that any further adverse employment action would be treated as retaliatory conduct in violation of Section 21F of the Securities Exchange Act as amended by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. The second was a preservation notice directed to the firm's general counsel, requiring the immediate preservation of all electronic communications, audit system logs, HR documentation, and financial records related to my employment, my audit activity, and the operational expense accounts I had reviewed. A preservation notice is a legal instrument that transforms evidence destruction from a civil liability into a potential criminal obstruction charge. It is the legal equivalent of removing the erasers from every pencil in the building. The third document was filed not with the firm but with the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. It was a sealed declaration supporting the federal investigation, incorporating my sworn account of the performance review, the prior meeting with Mercer, the non-disclosure agreement attempt, and the real-time monitoring of my audit access logs. Claire filed it under seal, which meant it was invisible to the firm's legal team while simultaneously becoming part of the formal federal record. I signed the declaration on a Tuesday evening in Claire's office. She had a notary present. The process took 40 minutes and felt, in the way that significant things sometimes feel in the middle of living through them, almost entirely ordinary. I signed my name in the places indicated. The notary stamped the pages. Claire collected the documents and placed them in a manila envelope that would go to the court filing service the following morning. "It is done," she said, not dramatically, simply as a statement of operational fact. I drove home, made dinner, and went to bed at 10:30. The following week the investigation entered what Garrett described, in the careful language of an active federal proceeding, as the documentation completion phase. This was the phase during which the evidence that had been gathered and subpoenaed and voluntarily provided was assembled into the formal prosecutorial record that would be presented to the grand jury for its determination on indictment. Garrett briefed me by phone twice during this period. The calls were precise, professional, and stripped of any language that could be characterized as speculative. He told me what I needed to know to understand my own position and nothing beyond that. I respected this. It was the same discipline I applied to audit findings: tell the recipient what they need to act on, not everything you know. What he told me was sufficient. The grand jury had examined the transaction records, the shell company documentation, the email chain to Gerald Fitch, and Martin Ellison's parallel audit findings from the related investment company. It had heard testimony from 3 witnesses whose identities Garrett did not disclose. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had completed its examination of the wire transfer records and had identified 19 discrete instances of interstate wire fraud across a 23-month period. The total amount involved had been revised upward from the $6,240,000 I had identified in my initial review. The complete accounting, incorporating the parallel scheme in the related investment company, had established a total fraudulent transfer amount of $14,800,000. The scale had more than doubled. I absorbed this information sitting in my car in the firm's underground parking garage before going up to the office, on a morning in the 7th week. I sat for a moment after the call ended, phone in my hand, looking at the concrete pillar in front of my parking space. $14,800,000. Moved across 19 discrete wire transfers over 23 months. By 3 senior executives at a firm whose compliance department had certified, in quarterly reports signed by my supervisor and countersigned by me, that the firm's internal controls were functioning effectively. I had signed those certifications. My name was on those documents. This was the piece of this situation that I had not spoken about with anyone except Claire, because it was the piece that sat heaviest and that required the most precise legal navigation. A compliance analyst who certifies the integrity of systems that are simultaneously being used for fraud occupies a complicated legal position regardless of whether they had knowledge of the fraud at the time of certification. Claire had addressed this directly and thoroughly. My certifications had been made in good faith, based on the information available to me under my clearance level at the time, and the concealment operation run by Mercer's team had been specifically designed to prevent analysts at my clearance level from accessing the relevant information. The concealment itself was exculpatory evidence of my good faith. She had also made a point of noting that the SEC's formal whistleblower program had been designed, in part, precisely for situations where internal compliance personnel discover fraud that has been deliberately hidden from them. The existence of the program assumed this scenario. I was not an anomaly to be managed. I was exactly the kind of person the program had been built to protect. I understood this intellectually. Understanding something intellectually and carrying it without weight are different things. I got out of the car, took the elevator to the 31st floor, and sat at my desk. The office had a different quality during this period. Nothing visible had changed. The same people occupied the same desks, the same meetings appeared on the same calendars, the same coffee machine on the 29th floor continued to malfunction in the same way. But there was something in the specific quality of silence around certain offices, a careful, maintained stillness, that I recognized as the behavioral signature of people who knew or suspected that something significant was approaching and had decided that the safest posture was complete professional stillness. The CFO had taken 2 unscheduled personal days the previous week, attributed to a family matter. The general counsel had canceled 3 external meetings. My direct supervisor had been conducting every conversation in his office with the door closed, which was not his normal practice. They did not know what was coming. But they could feel it arriving. The legal fortification was complete on a Thursday in the 8th week, when Garrett called to inform me that the grand jury had concluded its deliberations. He used the word concluded with a particular evenness that told me, without his having to say it explicitly, that the conclusion had been the one the evidence supported. The indictments would be filed under seal the following morning. The actual arrests, coordinated by the FBI with SEC enforcement support, were scheduled for Monday. He asked me if I had any questions. I had one. I asked whether the timing of the firm's scheduled board of directors meeting, which had been on the calendar for the following Thursday for 3 months and which I knew, from the investor relations calendar I had access to through my audit clearance, was intended to include a presentation by Daniel Mercer on the firm's annual performance and strategic outlook for the coming year. Garrett was quiet for a moment. I am not in a position to discuss operational timing, he said. But I can tell you that the agencies involved are aware of all relevant scheduling considerations. I thanked him and ended the call. Monday was 4 days away. Daniel Mercer had spent those 4 days preparing a presentation about the future of a firm he would not be running by the end of the week. I closed my laptop at 6:15, exactly when I always closed my laptop, said goodnight to the colleague whose desk was adjacent to mine, waited for the elevator with 2 other people, and rode down to the underground garage. 4 days. I had waited 8 weeks. 4 days was nothing at all. Chapter 10, The Public Checkmate and Lessons. Monday arrived the way significant days always arrive, looking exactly like every other day until it did not. I woke at 6, made coffee, fed my succulents, and put on the charcoal blazer I had laid out the night before with the deliberate attention of someone dressing for an event they have been anticipating for a long time. I drove to the office through ordinary morning traffic, parked in the underground garage in my usual spot, and took the elevator to the 31st floor. I was at my desk by 7:20. The office was quiet at that hour, the overhead lights at their lower morning frequency, the phones silent, the air carrying the familiar smell of industrial cleaning solution and yesterday's burnt coffee. I opened my laptop, navigated to my spreadsheet, and began working. I was the most composed person in that building. I was also the only person in that building who knew exactly what was going to happen in the next 3 hours. At 9:47, the same time I had found the subledger anomaly 8 weeks earlier, I heard the elevator bank open at the far end of the corridor. 4 people walked out. 2 of them were wearing the kind of dark, unassuming suits that communicate federal authority to anyone who has spent enough time around institutional environments to recognize the specific cut and bearing. The other 2 were in standard business attire and were carrying identification that they presented to the receptionist at the front desk with the calm, practiced efficiency of people who have done this many times before. The receptionist picked up her phone. Whatever she said into it produced no visible result, because the 4 individuals did not wait. They moved with the coordinated certainty of people operating on a specific timeline and walked directly down the corridor toward the corner office suite. The office had begun to notice the particular quality of collective attention that moves through an open-plan workspace when something anomalous happens, a shift in body language, a reorientation of eyes, a suspended quality in the ambient noise of keyboards and phone calls, moved across the floor in a slow wave. Philip, Daniel Mercer's assistant, stood up from his desk in the anteroom as the 4 individuals approached. One of the agents showed him a document. Philip sat back down. They went past him and into the corner office. From my desk, I could see the glass wall of the anteroom. I could not hear anything. I could see Philip sitting at his desk with the rigid stillness of someone who has just been told something he did not know how to process. 4 minutes passed. Daniel Mercer emerged from the corner office. His silver hair was precisely arranged. His suit was the charcoal brioni he wore on days when he had important external meetings. He was walking in the center of the 4 federal agents with the upright, measured posture of a man who had decided, in whatever calculation he had made in the last 4 minutes, that the most important thing remaining to him was the management of his visible bearing. He was not in handcuffs. That would come later, at the federal building, away from the 31st floor of a Chicago financial firm on a Monday morning. What he had now, what was walking with him down the corridor through the entirely silent open-plan office toward the elevator bank, was the comprehensive, irreversible collapse of everything he had spent 30 years constructing. Every person on that floor was watching. He did not look at any of us. He looked straight ahead, at the elevator doors, with the fixed gaze of a man who had chosen a point on the horizon and was navigating toward it purely by will. He passed my desk without turning his head. I watched him pass the way I had been watching everything for 8 weeks, with complete stillness, complete attention, and the absolute, practiced neutrality of someone who had already done everything that needed to be done and was simply present for the conclusion. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. The 4 agents stepped in around him. The doors closed. The floor remained silent for approximately 4 seconds. Then someone's phone rang, and the ordinary noise of the world resumed. I turned back to my spreadsheet. 40 minutes later, my desk phone rang. It was the firm's board chairman, calling from the emergency board session that had been convened 11 minutes after the arrest. He informed me, in the careful language of an institution in acute crisis management mode, that I had been formally placed on administrative leave pending an internal review, that I would be paid in full during the leave period, and that the board's outside counsel would be in contact with my attorney. I thanked him and ended the call. I closed my laptop, collected my personal items, put on my coat, and took the elevator to the underground garage. I drove north along Lakeshore Drive with the lake on my right, broad and flat and indifferently bright in the morning light. I called Claire from the car. She told me that the CFO and the General Counsel had been arrested simultaneously at their respective home addresses at 9:45. The head of internal audit had been taken into custody at O'Hare Airport, where he had arrived 90 minutes earlier carrying 2 pieces of luggage and a one-way business class ticket to Zurich. He had been 11 minutes from boarding when the FBI agents reached his gate. The charges filed against all 4 defendants included securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. The obstruction charge, which carried its own mandatory sentencing enhancement, derived in significant part from the retaliatory performance review and the non-disclosure agreement attempt. Every action they had taken to silence me had become a charge. 6 months later, all 4 defendants accepted plea agreements rather than proceed to trial. The evidence, Claire told me, had left their attorneys with very limited room for alternative arguments. Daniel Mercer was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. The CFO received 7. The General Counsel received 6. The head of internal audit, whose attempted flight to Zurich had been treated by the sentencing judge as a significant aggravating factor, received 8. The SEC's whistleblower program, under the provisions of Dodd-Frank, determined that I was eligible for a financial award based on the sanctions collected in the enforcement action. I will not disclose the specific amount. I will say that it was sufficient to render the question of my future employment, in its most immediate practical sense, considerably less urgent than it had been 8 weeks earlier when I stood on a Chicago sidewalk in March with a cold phone in my hand and a federal investigator on the other end of the line. I left the financial services industry. I now work independently, consulting for organizations on the design of compliance architectures that are resistant to exactly the kind of coordinated internal subversion I had spent 8 weeks documenting. I work from my apartment in Lincoln Park. The succulents on the windowsill are thriving. The coffee machine is excellent. I think about Rebecca Harmon, the one who sat at her desk at 7:20 on a Tuesday morning in March and opened a routine audit file, fairly often. I think about the specific ordinary quality of that moment, the humming lights and the quiet phones and the smell of cleaning solution, and the complete absence of any indication that the next 11 days would change the trajectory of everything that followed. I did not choose to find the fraud. I chose what to do with it after I found it. That distinction, small as it might appear from the outside, is the only one that matters. The first lesson is about the architecture of silence. Rebecca's most powerful decision was not filing the federal report. It was choosing not to react visibly when Daniel Mercer slid the performance review across his desk. Corrupt systems are engineered to provoke emotional responses, because emotional responses produce uncontrolled behavior, and uncontrolled behavior produces legal exposure. The person who can receive a direct threat and respond with procedural calm has already won the psychological dimension of the confrontation. Silence, in the presence of power attempting to intimidate, is not passivity. It is the most aggressive posture available to someone who is already holding the evidence. The second lesson is about the compounding value of documentation. Rebecca did not have one piece of evidence. She had an architecture of evidence, built across multiple independent sources, that corroborated itself at every point of intersection. Each document she filed with the SEC made the next document more powerful. Each retaliatory action taken against her became additional evidence of consciousness of guilt. This is the fundamental principle that distinguishes whistleblower cases that succeed from those that fail. It is not about having a smoking gun. It is about building a structure of proof so comprehensive that no single piece can be attacked without the entire structure remaining intact. The third and most important lesson is about the specific danger of underestimating someone who works quietly. Daniel Mercer had spent 11 years looking at Rebecca Harmon and seeing precisely what she had spent 11 years carefully presenting for him to see: a precise, invisible, reliable compliance analyst who caused no problems and generated no drama. He had built his fraud in her professional vicinity because he believed she was exactly what she appeared to be. What he had failed to understand is that the people who work quietly, who document everything, who never raise their voices in meetings and never send angry emails and never give their opponents a visible emotional target, are not quiet because they are without resources. They are quiet because they understand that noise announces your position before you are ready to be found. Rebecca was never invisible. She was waiting.